going to be talking in a little bit about her book, Escaping Hitler. I'll let her sort of talk all about that. Just to let you know what's happening, Phyllida will be talking for a while. Then we will have tea and cakes, and there are loads of cakes, and please eat them all. Otherwise we'll have to take them all home. And then after that, then Phyllida will be able to answer some questions. She's got and sell you some books. She's got loads of her books here, which are signed by both her and Joe Sterling. They are £19.95. 1950. 1950. There you go, it's a bargain. I've saved you. Yes, 45p. Anyway, over to you, I think.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Well, thanks very much for coming out on such a lovely day. You could have been gardening all the time. Right, let me move into position. Has anybody met or seen Joe speak before? No, that's unusual, because he has been for some years now doing public talks in all sorts of places, particularly in the city and at schools and in human library events. And it's rare to find no one who's seen him speak before. But that's fine, because I'll speak for him today. And has anyone here either taken a Sterling holiday or know of someone who went on a Sterling holiday? Got a lady here, that's good. Yeah, your parents went on one? Because I'll tell you later all about Joe's business, which is why he's best known in the city, particularly with the older generation. But meanwhile, how did I meet this young man? There he is. That's when he was 14. He's now 91, lives in the Unthank Road, was out with me this morning talking to a townswomen's guild. We try and restrict him to one a day, because at 91 that's probably against the law. But this afternoon I've come out to talk to you. So I met him because I needed a subject for my MA. I'd taken a long time to get a degree. I was a lazy schoolgirl, but later in life I took the Open University degree and managed to get a place for the MA at the UEA, obviously here in Norwich, where I'd already been working for 5 years as a secretary. So to cross that line from secretary to student was really exciting. And it gave me the confidence to think about writing my first book. Since I was about 12, I was always that annoying child, or younger than that, primary school it was, who would like to read out their composition first? Me, miss, me, miss. Oh, not Phyllida again. She usually writes for about half an hour. Okay. But I did, and I loved it. But I've done a bit of dabbling in journalism and other things, but never had a book. Here was my big chance, because one lunchtime at the UEA, when I was temping, waiting for my place to come up at the university, I went in and they were doing a human library event. Briefly, that's where you and I can volunteer to be a book for the day. If you have a story to tell, it's usually about prejudice. That's how it all started. And he was representing refugees that day. Unlike a refugee, can you imagine? He had a suit on, little chap, clearly elderly, but he was billed as, I escaped Nazi Germany. Well, in my naivety, I thought that can't be right. So I worked out the maths. Thought, yeah, he's got to be, he's got to be quite elderly, but I'm going to talk to him because he's obviously got a story. And within 5 minutes of hearing his life story, his childhood life story at that time, I knew that Joe Sterling was my subject. And for the past, that was in 2011, and ever since then, he has pretty much become my life. And I'd like to think that I'm a pretty big part in his life too. And he invited me for tea that day, because I didn't have time to listen to his whole story. I had to get back to work. But he invited me for tea, and I haven't stopped having tea since. So I've come today to tell you how you change a life story of 90 years into a book. Because obviously if you put down everything that any of us did, it would be a lot bigger than this. Well, I was learning at college, it's all about research, the people and the places. And I've certainly done my share of all those in the last 5 years. For a start, it was interviewing Joe. I went on a fortnightly basis, believing firmly that if I wrote his story, it would finish when he came to England on the Kinder transport. Because as you may have gathered from the title, Joe Sterling was born Gunther Stern in the Rhineland village of Nickernich, which is just a few miles up from Koblenz. And I'm sure many of us know of Koblenz, because of course it's Norwich's twin city, and many people have been there, and as I have, and what a beautiful place. But his little farming village was just up the road. He was born in 1924, and Mr. Hitler wasn't even in charge by then. And that blows my mind, really. So there he is. He's the poor son of a poor farmer. He wasn't even so much a farmer, Alfred. He was a stock dealer, really. He bought and sold cows, horses, goats on behalf of others, borrowing a van to go to Koblenz cattle market, buying some on behalf of a farmer in Nickenik, and coming back again. He and his wife, Ida, I'm sorry, Joe, I keep getting the pronunciations wrong, Ida lived in Nickenik. They were the only one of only three Jewish families in a village, quite a large village, of about 2,000 people, of which he likes to tell people there were only 2 cars. At that time there were 2 cars. The doctor had one and a wealthy farmer had another. But apart from that, you could play anywhere you liked. He was a young boy with many friends, an only child, and the only difference between him and his schoolmates were that he went to synagogue on a Saturday and they all went to St. Arnulf's Catholic church at the top of the hill on a Sunday. And that was the only difference for many years. No problem at all. Well, as you can imagine, I wanted to go and see this place that he told me all about. And I'll tell the story of his life as we go through. So I started to research him, and the Germany bit came along in September 2013. I'd already been talking with Joe for 2 years, but the details he remembers, his memory is immense. There's no way I can think back to my early life and record nearly just a tenth of what he can remember. Of course, my comrades at college said, "Are you sure he's not making it up?" Well, at that point, I couldn't be sure. But I can assure you, over the next 4 years, every piece of research I did rang true. I met people who could verify the stories, and the history showed the rest. So let's do Germany. So off we go to Germany in the car from Harwich, because Harwich, of course, is where the Kinder transport trains came into. So I had to start our journey, our footstepping journey, as I believe it's known, from Harwich and across on the ferry, drove down into Germany and were met by a lovely family in the city of Koblenz who had already befriended Joe because he spent a lot of time in the last few years helping students, both British and overseas, with their projects about the Holocaust, about the Kinder transport. It's very rare to meet a youngster who was on that Kinder transport out of Germany in 1939. And people do latch onto him. They do want to hear his stories. And the following morning, they took us to Nickenik. Now, here's the village where he lived. This is the place he's been telling me about for 2 years. I've seen pictures online, but here I am on the very cobblestones that he would have played as a boy. In the very surrounding fields, the lake, all the countryside around, where he had this pastoral life. And then if I tell you, and I'm sure you all know this, things got worse for them in the village as Hitler took over and began to show his anti-Semitism and all the other terrible things he was devising for the people. They began to realise that their lives were going to be troubled. They didn't suspect their lives were in danger at this point, but bit by bit the neighbours and his school friends started to avoid him. They were told, if you're seen dealing with that Jewish cattle dealer, you will be arrested. You must stop it right now. And so bit by bit, his father's business was cut back. And Joe said to his dad, "I keep hearing about Mr. Hitler not liking the Jewish people. Why? Aren't we Jewish?" And he said, "Yes, son. He says that we're just pretending to be Germans. But of course, we know that's not true. But don't worry, son," says Alfred. "I was a veteran. I fought in the First World War. I was a dispatch rider at the front. I was wounded 4 times. I won the Iron Cross. Hitler and his friends won't do anything to us. We'll be fine. He likes the veterans. He is a veteran. Don't worry." So Joe didn't worry and got on with his life. But then that dreadful night of Kristallnacht in November 1938, when Hitler saw an excuse to set forth his Rottweilers and his brown shirts onto every Jewish family and businessman in the country and in Austria, which now, of course, was held by the Germans. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I don't tell this story as well as Joe does, and I apologise, he's not here to tell you this, but the story goes, and it's all documented in the prologue of the book. In fact, why don't I read you the prologue of the book? And then you'll get an idea, rather than just paraphrase it. This is what happened in Nicheny on the night of, in November 1938. Here we are, visitors. It happened so quickly. Loud hammering on the door at around 4 in the morning. Gunther instantly awake. His father's heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs. The boy creeping from his body-warm bed, joining mother at the top of the staircase. More banging. Raised, angry voices. The door swinging open. Rusty hinges straining under the force. 3 or 4 men bursting over the threshold. Uninvited. Invading their home. Strangers from Andernach or even Koblenz, clutching cudgels and brandishing revolvers. Alfred Stern, get dressed, you're arrested. Arrested? What have I done? Gunther flinches as his father takes a violent blow across the face. 2 men climb the stairs, pushing past woman and child, roughnecks turning out drawers and cupboards, throwing contents onto the floor, trampling over china and glass. Ida and Gunther stunned, silent, shaking. Her husband pushed through the door and onto the cobbles of the Hintergasse. Ida's throat opens and she screams out, "Where are you taking him?" No reply. Just the muffled sound of Alfred's anguished objections to being treated as a criminal. He fought bravely for his country. He was wounded 4 times. He was awarded the Iron Cross. Soon his cries and the marching feet are no longer audible, and the night is still once more. That's more or less exactly as Joe told me. I thought it wasn't worth making up anything else. Let's use his words. And how he does remember that moment vividly. And of course it was important for the whole of Germany, because it opened up the eyes to the rest of the world of what was going on, when all the males over 16 were imprisoned in a concentration camp. All the men over 70 were put into local police prisons, and just let them kick their heels for a couple of weeks before we let them go back to their wives. So Ida fled that village. She left Nicheny the following morning with her boy and went to Koblenz. So imagine the scene. I'm stood outside the very house that this happened. It's still there. It looks slightly different. They've taken out the arch where the horse and cart used to go through, and it's now a garage door, but it's in effect the same house. And that, to me, as a biographer, as a human being, as a woman, as a mother, was an incredible moment I shall never ever forget. So Joe is taken by his mother to Koblenz, as I say, and his father is taken to Dachau up in the Bavarian mountains, a pretty awful prison camp. They're not death camps at this point. Remember, the war hasn't started. These are prison camps for anti-Nazi protesters and Jewish people and others, and we all know the list. It goes endless. But he gets very ill in the snow. It's the winter, of course, and he gets pneumonia. And so they let him out, but only once he's signed a document to say, "I will be actively seeking to take my family out of Germany." As long as the men promised that they would make every effort to leave the country. They just wanted rid of them, that was all, at that point. He was allowed to go home. And I'll show you the home he went home to. Because, bear with me. Should have put a little mark on it here. Because this is the city of Koblenz. This is 2013, when we found the flat that his father, mother and himself were taken to in January 39. And I went to Germany just 2 weeks ago, my second trip, to do a book signing in both Koblenz and Nicheny. We've been invited by the mayor of Nicheny to do so, and we managed to get another one booked for Koblenz. And that was all I had. And that's fine, but obviously it's a modern block, it's now a shopping centre, it's a clothes shop, a bit like Primark but slightly higher class. But as a result of the newspaper reports in the German newspapers, just last week I had an email from a lady called Hildegard, and she said, when my mother, who's 90, read the report about your talk in Koblenz, and I had luckily mentioned the address at 6 Gurgenstrasse, Koblenz. She said, my mother said, oh, I know Ida Stern. I know Ida Stern. And so she's written to me to say her mother, who was a child of about Joe's age, about 14 at the time, and her family had moved into this block. This is the block. That's how it was when Joe's family moved in 1939. Once he'd gone to England, about a month or two later, this family moved in. So they never knew Joe, they never knew little Gunther, but they knew his parents. And they would have been there in 1942 when the Nazi jeep came for them to take them to the trains to take them north. So she remembers that vividly. I've sent her a book. I've asked her to take a photograph of her mother with the book, because what a treasure that will be and something to show Joe. So, moving on. Our first trip, as I say, in 2013, we also then followed his walk. Now, the next claim to fame that Joe has, and the bit he loves to tell the most, is the fact that once his father had come out, they realised they'd better get this boy a ticket for the Kindertransport. The world had woken up. Britain said, OK, you can have 10,000 kids. We won't take the adults, but send the children. Because they'd all been expelled from school on Kristallnacht. They couldn't do anything. There was fear and more fear in the country for their lives. And many parents decided to sacrifice their child to give them a future. And one of those couples was Ida and Alfred. Reluctantly, of course, but they did apply for a ticket. Now, this boy was 14. People in England didn't necessarily want to look after a 14-year-old teenage boy. Frankly, would any of us? I'm sure most of us have been there, and oh boy, that's a tricky period. They liked the little girls of 7, they liked the girls of 12, because they could help in the kitchen. But boys of 14? So he was way down the list. Nobody was claiming him. So he waited and waited and waited. His father arranged for him to go and work for a farmer so that they could feed him. They couldn't afford to feed him. So it wasn't a Jewish man, it was a Christian farmer down in the village of Cockham on the Mosel. And that's the next place we went. We took our car and we drove to Cockham, and we saw and absorbed ourselves in the feeling of young Gunther. Because what he did one night was he decided in July, early July, I'm not waiting any longer for those Brits to send me a visa, I'm going. So he left a little letter on the table to the farmer saying, tell my mother I'll write to her when I get there. I'm going to England on my own. And he did. Well, he didn't, actually. He walked for 7 days. He walked, he waded through the River Sauer at Echternach into Luxembourg illegally. So we went to Echternach. That's a nice little town. And we saw the water, and he probably did it further out of town, to be fair, otherwise he'd have got into trouble. But it was the same water. And then he walked up through the fields of Belgium, fields and forests. I said Luxembourg was apparently fields, Belgium is forests. Following the rivers, nearly there, his idea is to hitch a lift to the hook and get on one of those boats that he'd read about. So he gets as far as a little town called Val. Now, I can't prove that, but talking to Joe and looking at maps and looking at various things, I think it's likely, where a policeman picked him up. And the story of what happens to that, he has told me many times, and it's recorded pretty much as he told me here. The upshot of it was that the Dutch policeman was, of course, on side. He wasn't anti the little Jewish boy from Germany, but they did discover that he could no way get into England without that visa. They were block visas for the children, or with their names down for the Kindertransport trains. He had to go back to Nazi Germany. So they took this boy to the station of Aachen, just inside Germany, dead of night. They waited on the platform for the first morning train. The farmer paid his ticket and sent him back to his mum. His mum, who was waiting in that house to see if he was ever going to see her son again. And after about 10, 12 days, he turned up on the doorstep. Couldn't ring her up on his mobile, send her a quick email. By the time the letter got there, the war would have started. So she was so pleased. And he says, she just gave me a big hug, like any mother would. But only a fortnight later, the ticket turned up. And this was the next stop on our trip. We went to Cologne station. I wanted to stand on that platform where he and 3 other Jewish children on that particular Sunday in July were put onto those trains. The parents were not allowed to get near the train. In the early days, they started in December 38, and they quickly discovered that it was chaos. There were parents pulling the children back out through the windows. Kids wouldn't let their parents go. They were having to absolutely force them on. So they by now, when young Gunther went, they kept the parents back. And he stood there on the platform, and it's time to say goodbye. And he tells his story extremely well again. He remembers it so well. His father whispered to his mother, "Now remember what you promised me. No tears until he's gone." I know, it's tough, isn't it, Alan? It's really tough. But he was keen. He was a savvy lad. He was keen. You could tell that from that walk across Europe. He knew his life was in danger. His plan, as so many were, to get his parents out once he was in England. He'd find them a job. They were clever, intelligent, hard-working people. He could get them a job on a farm, housekeeping, anything. But of course, as we know, sadly, it wasn't long before the war started, and there wasn't time to get them out. So we've now got a young man in England, and so our trip home from there was the same trip back on the boat. Now we get to the English bit, which of course is a totally different way of research, because I can actually get hold of people who remember him. And I did. Because, and I will now start to speed up a little bit, fast forward, but that is the bit that I thought, genuinely, I would write about. What I didn't take into account was that once Joe continued to tell me about the next, well, it must be the next 75 years of his life, that would be just as compelling, just as interesting for me to research and write about. So that's why the book turned from a war story into a life biography. And he was taken to Birmingham, to a family who understood education, got him this place at Yardley Grammar School. The Cadburys were giving money for that, bursaries, he got one of those. But the minute the war broke out, Yardley transferred a whole entire grammar school to Lydney in Gloucestershire, which was considered much more safe than Birmingham would be, and they're probably quite right. But of course this little lad has only been in the country a few months, he can hardly speak any English. And Mrs. Free, the woman who took him on, said to the school, "Can he come and join you in January? I really want him to settle in with my family first." But settling in was living in their holiday home, I think they were quite well off, in their holiday home in North Wales. So the school said he must go to school in Wales, because I want to, get him ready for education. What they didn't realise was it was an all Welsh-speaking school. So here's this little lad of 14, going to school with Welsh children, and he can hardly speak English yet. He tells me he could speak more Welsh that winter than he could English. Now, from that particular connection, I managed to research the daughter of that family, and I found out what school she went to in Birmingham. She died prematurely, sadly, but the school remembered her. They'd even had a library named after her, because her mother had given a legacy. So this is all I'm doing, is illustrating the kind of detail that I've been told is included in this book by kind readers, and how you come about finding them out. People want to share their stories, they want to be a part of it. So then he goes to Lydney, and he joins another family. They're like his landlord, if you like. The brother has to move into the bedroom with his little sister. He didn't like that much. And Joe Long, boy's bit. The brother was about 11, that's right, the little boy. Well, the little girl was called Hazel. And she kept in touch with Joe for many years, and then lost touch when she was widowed. About 15 years ago, say. He thought perhaps she died, but had no way of finding out where she was. So I wrote a letter to the Lydney local newspaper. Said, anyone remember the Allsop family of Spring Meadow? Do you know I had 4 emails and 5 letters back? And a week later, my phone rang one Sunday afternoon, and a lady's voice said, "Hello, I'm Hazel Allsop. I believe you're looking for me." I've got goosebumps just telling you, because there she was, this child that I'd heard about, really alive, talking to me fine. And back in touch with Joe, because of course I swapped addresses and they now write to each other again. I doubt they'll either travel to each other ever again because they are elderly and frail and they probably won't. But they're in touch, so that's great. So that was another contact I made. And now quickly whizzing into Norwich. He gets to Norwich because he does his very well in his A-levels, but he refuses and turns down a place at university. He goes and joins the army, and in the army he doesn't see action because he is, damaged. What's the word? Hurt, you know.
Injured.
Injured, that's the word. Injured in training in Scotland. But thank goodness for it, because not only did he not die in action, but he met a young lady called Jean Skidmore, who was an Attleborough Brethren girl. And she was also working in Basingstoke in uniform in the Ordnance Corps. And they got married in Aldershot Church the year after the war finished. And it was quite a large family. There were 3 sisters and a brother. And we have the offspring of the brother in the room today, don't we? Got the facts right? Yeah. Gail Scott here, who's a Mulbarton resident, is the son, and I've gone completely, your father, I've gone completely blank. Gordon, thank you so much, I do apologise. Gordon is her dad. So because of that, when I asked Joe to introduce me to members of his living family, Gail was one of the lovely people who invited me over to her lovely home to sit in the garden on a day like this, and I recorded her memories of Jo and her childhood, which was an interesting childhood. And if you really want to know all about it, it's in here. I won't embarrass her now by going into it, but it did mean she was very close to Joe Sterling and his wife for a number of years, and still is. It's still your favourite uncle, isn't it? Yes. Jean sadly has died. She died about 12 years ago now, but Joe is still going strong. So family members are so helpful too, of course, and many of them did help me out. I met some brethren down in Attleborough. They invited me down. I didn't know anything about that religion. I needed a bit more background about how it would have worked. A Jewish boy from Germany marrying a brethren girl during wartime, how's that work? Well, they were the most delightful couple, apparently, and really welcomed him in, because on the side of the church where the groom sits, there was only him. So sad. So let me try and bring this up to date then. So Joe Sterling, he came to Norwich, married an Attleborough girl, left the army, lived in Attleborough for a while, got a job in Norwich with the Labour Party. He was an agent, secretary agent, which brings Shirley Williams into the story. Some of you may wonder, perhaps you haven't noticed, but I was fortunate enough to have Shirley Williams, I'm sure you don't need to tell you who she is, do the foreword for the book. In 1955, in her very first by-election, Jo was sent as an agent to Harwich, which is where the by-election was, to help this young woman straight out of Oxford to try and win her first seat in Parliament. They failed, but they got to know each other very well. And when I wrote to her later, I reminded her too that her mother, Vera Britton, was at college with the Mrs. Free from Birmingham. Are you keeping up? The connections began to be incredible. So, as I say, just a little bit more about his more current life. When I say current life, the last 50 years. He came to Norwich, joined the Labour Party, took a group of people to Koblenz for a short holiday because he was asked to, because he speaks German and knew the patch. He was happy to do that. But when his colleague on the way home on the boat whispered in his ear, "How about starting a travel agency, Joe?" He took the idea home to Jean, who, because she loved him, probably said, "Yeah, go on then." So he gave up the job, started a travel agency. By the time he retired from that, they had employed 75 people, had had 6 different offices, and frankly had left his family a pretty good legacy. So good for him, this little boy with the suitcase had started this massive company. Not only that, in 75 the city honoured him as sheriff. He was our sheriff for a year, wearing that dirty grey coat. He wouldn't take it off even in heat like this. Big hat, loved it, riding in the coach and horses, meeting royalty, generally having a lovely time. I interviewed the Lord Mayor of that time, of that year. She sadly died now, Joyce Morgan. Maybe some of you remember Joyce Morgan, from 1975. She was the shop girl Lord Mayor. She worked in C&A's on a Saturday. still continued her job throughout her year. So I interviewed her. And then the Lions, to finish with the Lions. He's been a Lion International fundraising group, international worldwide, for over 50 years, still is. And his claim to fame in that, apart from being a district governor and raising loads of money for local and international charities, is that his business, Sterling Travel, took for 21 consecutive summers the entire British contingent of Lions to the international convention, wherever it was, be it one of the cities of Canada or America, later to Japan, to Thailand, down to Australia. That, combined with his own travel business, which went international eventually, has taken him probably to every corner of the globe. I think Ida and Alfred would be jolly proud of that, don't you? I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Would you like me to write your way? No. They always told me. Yeah. Everybody told me. She could. I would have. Maybe I had my best. Yes, right. Thank God you stayed, yeah. But you suffered, did you? Well, family suffered. No. You got the lucky.